first encountered when it was suggested that he be a speaker at our Islam and Western Civilization conference. He spoke at that, and since then I've become great friends with him. He's an expert on political warfare, the Maoist insurgency model, everything to do with the left, its history. He wrote an amazing book, Catastrophic Failure, that he had spoken about at our Islam conference. We also had him speak at our Long March conference. He and his co-founder and co-chair, I guess, of Unconstrained Analytics came and did an amazing briefing at our Long March conference about leftist insurgency. He's a senior fellow at Center for Security Policy and the Claremont Institute, author, as I said, of Catastrophic Failure, and most recently of Re-Remembering the Misremembered Left, which you can, amazing. It's got so much information and so much connecting the dots, it will knock your socks off. Steve Coughlin.
Thank you, it's a pleasure to be here. Even given all the theater. So what I want to do, this brief was going to be a little eclectic by hitting a couple issues dealing with the left. But you know, there's a lot of stuff in the news lately about what's happening in Afghanistan. And it's not just that I'm blowing my own horn on this, but what we're seeing right now was made inevitable by the fact that in 2005, we wrote the constitutions for Iraq and Afghanistan. If we could go to the screen. I took this right out of a paper I wrote in 2007, but I actually briefed it on the Joint Staff. And I just want you to see what this Constitution says that we wrote. Article 1, Afghanistan is an Islamic Republic, independent, unitary, and an indivisible state. Article 2, the religion of the state of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan is the sacred religion of Islam. We wrote a constitution that made Afghanistan an Islamic Republic. And up to that point, and to this day, Islamic republics have a certain identity to them that puts them really close to all the terrorism we see. And finally, Article 3. In Afghanistan, no law can be contrary to the beliefs and provisions of the sacred religion of Islam. Now, I was still on the Joint Staff at the time, and I basically warned that if we pass this, if the Afghanis, and also the Iraqis, by the way, we had a similar one with Iraq, if this language, Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3, were ratified in Afghanistan, at that moment we lost the war. Because at that moment we created a constitution that was designed for somebody like the Taliban to be in charge. And what it meant was, at the time Karzai was in control, I don't even know who's in control of Afghanistan anymore, but what it meant was every time we asked Karzai to do something for us going up against ISIS, Al-Qaeda, or the Taliban, and it would violate Islamic law, as the Taliban would point out, it meant that they were violating the constitution that we wrote. So what I will argue is, I think that it's a total S show, but and I think the current president has really mismanaged this badly. But at the end of the day, we lost in 2005, and this is a constitution that the U.S. forced on the Afghanis and on the Iraqis. So with that, I just want to point that out, because earlier today I was sending out all the stuff on Twitter. I have a Twitter account to show all the things that were written warning that this was going to happen. So it's a disaster, and I won't argue against it. Just so you know, this was part of a thesis for the National Defense and Intelligence Agency that was accepted, that I wrote in 2007, the National Defense Intelligence College. So I put it in writing. You should know, within 5 months of me writing this thesis, I was being pushed out of the Pentagon. So this thesis cost me a lot. So with that, I think we'll open that up to questions later. But what I'd like to do before I go into the main parts of the brief, because I know that people are going to be asking questions about this, is this is our webpage right here. Okay, let me just make this the full page for a second. Well, so, and what we put out was, there it is, catastrophic failure in 2015. That specifically and in detail 700 pages, in detail showed how what we were doing was a disaster. Then in 2016, I wrote a book called Burning Down the House. That's what this document is. You can get it on, it's for free. And Burning Down the House is about how Islamic splinter movements work, so that when the Ummah, the leadership elements of the Islamic world, say one thing, it causes, like the OIC, it causes groups like the Dawah movements, like the Muslim Brotherhood, to message a certain thing that becomes permissive of jihadi groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS to act. And a couple months after that, we put out in the same year, Defeating the Islamic Movement Inside the United States. This is 2016. And what this did was show that in the West, the Islamic movement aligned itself with the neo-Marxist left through a political warfare regime. And the political warfare, when we talk about that, we mean the Maoist insurgency model. And that the Islamic movement subordinated their language and narratives to that. A lot of people don't know this, but the originators of the term Islamophobia comes from the Runnymede Institute in London. It does not come from the Islamic movement or from any of those countries, although they adopted it. Then moving after that, in 2019, we put out Re-Remembering the Misremembered Left, which turned out to be a big paper, like 200 pages. And it argued that we better get our head out of our other places, because we not only don't understand, we have not only forgotten what the left is, but what we think we know it is wrong. And in fact, I don't want to steal my lines for the main brief, but this, if there's a united front effort, this explains how united front efforts work in detail so that you could see it. Then last fall, in the fall, a year before the election, I think, let me see the date, it was November 2019, I put out something called Warning on Racism that warned that the election was going to be used, the upcoming election was going to be used to do exactly what happened. We called this exactly. And then finally, I just want to point out that in May 30th, 2020, we published When Does a State Become a Counter-State? That's a Marxist term, and it was Requiem for Minnesota, because we said that everything's going to start in Minnesota. Now, people who are close to the calendar will remember this is after events started in Minnesota, but we have a paper trail that shows that it was being edited a week before things happened in Minnesota. So that we called it exactly. And why is this important? Because people will come up and say, Steve, you have a crystal ball. And we don't have a crystal ball. We do not have a crystal ball. What we have are analytical processes that orient on facts, recognizing that most people are trapped in narratives. So I am arguing that people should really take a look at those two papers, because it's going to become important. Burning Down the House, because that's on again. Okay, and so is this Defending the Islamic Movement. They're both not the biggest papers. Each one's about 30 pages. I was putting stuff out on Twitter on all the stuff that was written at that time. Now the second part is really the main briefing, and so we're going to do that. And you know, I wrote these little notes to myself because I make myself promise before I leave the brief. I make sure I hit every one of them. I'm suffering from what everybody calls chemo brain, because I just came out of chemo, so I could be in the middle of a sentence and all of a sudden just look at someone and they have to say, no, you know, that's what you meant to say. But so I want to make sure I say this. What you're going to see right now is actually a briefing I originally gave in 2015, in January 2015, to a closed by invitation only group on Capitol Hill that met every Wednesday, and by invitation only conservative Republican groups. And it was after the Tea Party had won a landslide victory, and I said, you're not going to get anything out of this. You'll get nothing. And people got a little irate, and I explained that the Republican Party was what we'll call a controlled opposition of the left. And because they're a controlled opposition of the left, they will bend over backwards and do somersaults to try to convince you they did everything they could, when in fact they never had any intention of doing what they were elected to do. And so this briefing was really about a briefing that explained how they could expect to see what they say. And it's called the Statistical Trimaran because it's based on a visualization. So before I go into the specific slides on this, what I want to do is make sure I hit my little notes here. And this is based on the fact that the left that we're looking at is Marxism. Okay, if you're afraid to say Marxism or communism, you're actually batting for the other team, because it tells me, and it tells people, including the other side, that you're afraid to call it what it is. And in fact, it's not just Marxism. It's Marxism that follows the political warfare methodology, which is the same as saying the Maoist insurgency model. Okay? With the Maoist insurgency model, you have a whole series of things, once you understand what it is, that you can then predict how they're going to run and how they're going to operate. The Maoist insurgency model and Marxism generally operates on what are called command and control narratives. So we like to think that there's a line and block chart, right? In charge, this guy will say that. But they don't operate that way, and it completely short circuits us, because we're never aware of how they're communicating, and therefore we don't understand that they can do what we'll call open communication. In quotes, open communication, meaning that they can communicate on the news, on TV shows, their message, and they will know their people understand the message, and you'll say, what the heck were they just saying? And I will give you a very good example of that. When you heard, after the events in Minnesota started, the Attorney General of Minnesota, the Mayor of Minneapolis, the Governor of Minnesota, and then most left-leaning political leaders and some Republicans start using the word peaceful protest, you were thinking, that's crazy, these are anything but peaceful. But what they were really communicating to the people on that open communication was, we are going to determine that what you're doing is peaceful, and therefore you have a free hand. On the other hand, anybody who opposes you is engaged in disruption, and we'll go after them. So that when a mother who's 9 months pregnant trying to get to a hospital with her 18-month daughter in the car can't get through because she's being blocked, the police will say, no, we can't help you, that's a peaceful protest. When somebody comes out of their house with guns, not pointing at anybody, they're the ones who will get arrested. My point is, that's command and control language, and there's nothing random about it. And if you pick it up early, you can intercept it before it hits ground zero. And so it's very important. So I think I got... So what I want to really do here now, as I go into this, is I want to throw out an aphorism, and it's an aphorism I've been using for a while, and that is this. But I want people to really understand this, because at some point, the word political correctness escalated to the term hate speech, okay? And it's an escalation and an understood narrative arc. And of course, what I'm saying again is the left operates in narrative arcs, okay? And they have initiate language where the initiates understand the language and you don't. So you can't see what they're doing. I know I just repeated myself. The aphorism is this: political correctness is the enforcement mechanism to the postmodern narrative that executes Marxism. And that has always been true. So I'll repeat that. Political correctness is the enforcement mechanism to the postmodern narrative that implements cultural Marxism. Why do I want you to know this? Because what makes the Republican establishment a controlled opposition isn't that they're Marxist, it's that they obey the narrative. And obeying the narrative, they execute the left's mission regardless of whether they understand that they do. And that's what this brief was about in 2015, and that's why it is so popular today on Capitol Hill. There were people who remembered I gave this, and now everybody sees that it was exactly correct right down the line. So, what am I saying? The very way we talk about the left guarantees we can't get to the issue, because the very way we talk about the left is the way the left allows you to talk about it, okay? And if people don't agree with that, just start talking about Marxism and see how long you get yanked off Twitter, so long as you do it accurately. So, excuse me. So what I want to do is just move into this brief. It's the Political Trimaran, and this is the scene setter. So we'll start this briefing, move to the screen, and I just want to say before I do a couple slides leading into it that this is the language that I will be using when I put together the whole training module for how to understand the left. Demoralize, disenfranchise, teleological, reification, deracinate, recursive, discursive, dissociation. Okay, what am I trying to say here as it relates to this brief? The left cannot disenfranchise you unless you are first demoralized. And the role of the Republican establishment is to demoralize you. And they understand that's their mission. So There's a whole block of instruction to this. This is just a slide to get people to think about the fact that if you really want to know what Marxism is, you've got to catch it at the beginning and realize it was really tightly associated with all these secret societies back in the 1840s, and in fact they originated out of it. Now the problem is that means you have to get into some weird stuff and get comfortable with it. And of course professionals don't talk about that stuff. And therefore professionals are always wrong. And you want to have a good example, just look at Afghanistan right now. Okay, they were the best and the brightest, of course staggeringly stupid. And the other part of this is from the very beginning, the whole destruction of society was based on the fact that they had to destroy the culture, and that the core of that was to destroy any concept of a Judeo-Christian God. And Judeo-Christian God becomes important here because in the first book of Genesis you have man created in the image of God. And that is the basis of the Declaration of Independence. Man, rights endowed by the Creator. Because man was created before the state and ahead of the state, he has rights coming from God that are above those rights. And what you see right now is the active destruction, demolition of that. Now for people who will say, Steve, that's all good and fine, but I don't believe in God. Well, that's fine. I'm not going to get into that discussion. What I will tell you is the minute you get rid of that construction, rights come from, exist outside the state and above the state because they were created by God. What you default to are rights that are granted by the state. And of course, they become privileges. So that's why I have that. In June 2021, we're taking a look at the Pentagon, and the Pentagon started talking about something that was almost pretty much dropped from public discussion in the Trump administration. It's all back, and it's back in full motion. It's this countering extremism narrative that you could see the Department of Defense is on full board with. And in the same month, you saw the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism. And who are the terrorists? It's you. If you're at this meeting, it's you. Okay? So what you have is a situation where you have your government going after Americans who dare to say we're Americans. That's what that's all about. And if you have any doubt, this just came out a couple days ago, potential terror threats. What are the biggest things the Department of the DHS is looking at? Opposition to COVID measures, claims of election fraud, belief Trump can be reinstated. You know, do you notice how they link election fraud with beliefs that Trump could be reinstated? I know a lot of people think we're election fraud who know that Trump probably will not be back. And there was election fraud, and everybody knows it. And I think the people who voted Democrat are starting to really reconsider that. So then you have the 9/11 anniversary and religious holidays. I'm going to tell you what, with what we're seeing in Afghanistan and the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States cycling up their narratives and posturing, that's something that should come back into the frame, and we should be very aware that they are aligned with the far left. In fact, in many large cities, it was the Muslim Brotherhood who did the ground game for Antifa and BLM, and we have the documentation to show that. So, with that, we go into this Trimaran Brief, and what I like to say is it was first given in 2015 when multiple people were talking about the fact that the Republican leadership at the time, right up to the transition, were expressing their great concern about the extreme 8%. Does anybody remember that? We have to get rid of that extreme 8%, that extreme 8%, okay? Well, you know what? That happens to be the same people they're talking about today using different language. And one of the people who expressed it the most, or quite often, on Fox was Luntz, Frank Luntz. So, what I have here is the normal curve. And what we're going to do is we're going to introduce the political trimaran from this. Now, the normal curve is just the bell curve, and what you have is, in this picture, 68% of everything that exists in the curve exists within the first standard deviation, 95% within the second, and 99.7 within the third. Pretty much you have everything. Okay? Interesting enough, just an aside, healthy people would be outside, people who die who are healthy are outside the 99.7%. Just putting it out there, okay, for people to think about. So what we did was we took a look at this, and sometimes the brief jumps when we're hooked up, so I have to apologize. So what we have is this normal curve, and that's 68% of the vote when you look at it politically. Okay, then what you have here is 60% of the conservative vote is outside that standard deviation, and then you have that extreme 8%. I'll say this now, although it might come up again. They keep talking about that extreme 8% that they want to get rid of. However, to win elections, to get a majority, they always have to adopt their issues. So you understand that their concept of what the extreme 8% is itself convoluted. But what it also tells you is they hate their base. They hate their base. They hate you, okay? And therefore, they do not feel conflicted about lying to you. They're not rhinos. So, this is where we bring in the trimaran, the political statistical trimaran. And that's that boat. And as you can see in the background, slowly a river is starting to appear. And we're going to put this trimaran in that water. Now, why is it a trimaran? Because we'll say the outlier on the left, on the right, is the Republican outlier, the outrigger. And on the right is the Democratic Party. What I didn't say at the time, because it was a little bit too touchy in 2015, the name of that boat is the SS Karl Marx. Okay? And this was about all those Republicans on that trimaran. So think about whether you could be a relative conservative, a relative patriotic American. How about just a relative normal American who just wants to live an American life? Well, the question becomes, remember, the Republican on that right outlier is always more conservative than everybody else on the boat, even if the boat is floating to the left. Fair enough? So, in 2021, back in 2015, it was a horrid 8%. Now it's unity. How many people have heard that? Unity, unity. But that unity actually doesn't include you. What's happening is they're expecting a whole bunch of Democrats to shake loose from the Democratic Party because what they're seeing is such a monstrosity that they'll get some of them and they can then get rid of the 8%. That's their thinking. So see what you see? They want to basically capture the 8% that's on the second standard deviation and get rid of you. This has not changed, is what I'm saying. So this is the prevailing perception, the non-narrative view. And what we have is a picture of this boat running down the ocean. The prevailing non-narrative views, you have the moderates in the center, you have the center-left Democrats and the center-right. You know, this might have been true in the period of the 80s with Ronald Reagan. Somewhere in the 90s, it stopped being true. Somewhere in the 90s, the Democratic leadership became covertly Marxist. And we know that because the people leading the party now were pretty much high up in the order back then. So what if that picture was then? You know, I remember that song, that was then, this is now. What if that was then, but we think like it was today? Well, here we have a problem because that river actually, you see, that river, we're coming up on a break in the river, and it cuts either right or left. And here it is, that trimaran is heading right there. Well, what's going to happen? Where's the boat going to go? Because on the right side, you have the Constitution, you have the rule of law, you have national sovereignty, individual rights, reason, by which I mean the law of identity. And if someone wants to know what I mean by that, just go ahead and ask, and I'll tell you what the law of identity is. It goes all the way back to Aristotle, and believe me, I brought a book on Aristotle I can read to you, which my wife will tell you I love doing. And my daughter says, "Dad, please save me. Mom, save me from my dad." I'm actually not joking. So and then on the left, you have globalism, undermine national sovereignty, multiculturalism and diversity. You have racism, sexism, homophobia, political correctness, the destruction of identity, and imposing 2 + 2 = 5. If you're a YY person, you are biologically female, and that's a biological fact. If you're an XY person, you are biologically a male, and that's a biological fact. Genderism is a pseudoscience, and every time someone obeys it, they are obeying a pseudoscience. Okay? And they are basically saying 2 + 2 = 5. And that's the goal. So what's the thing we need to look about this? When we talk about the left and we're talking about Marxism, guess what? There is no middle. Rule 1. There is no middle. Now, what am I talking about? In the language of Marxism, you have something called dialectical materialism, which comes from Hegel's dialectic, and it's the idea that something is created that negates something else. I'm going to use the word binary. You have something. Let's call it America, not some kind of weird survivalist concept of America, a healthy understanding that you grew up in America and this is your country. That's here. Well, we'll create its opposite, and we'll create as many opposites as we can to destroy your concept of America and actually make you afraid to defend America out in public. That's negation, okay? It's dialectical negation. So a binary is created to get rid of something. But what that means is once you understand you're in a Marxist construct, there is no middle. And every Republican who moves to the middle to come to common ground is moving to the left, okay? If you are conservative and you keep moving to the middle, you're moving to the left. And I would argue that the mainstream of the Republican Party today is to the left or a whole bunch of them are to the left of, the gentleman who ran for president in 1972, McGovern, or are pretty close to that. The language has evolved, but it's the same, they have moved that far left. Now, think about this mantra since Ronald Reagan. You go to a political caucus in your district, and what happens? They see that there's a Tea Party movement, or they see that there's a MAGA movement, and they create their clone to try to get the guy who's a really MAGA or the woman who's really Tea Party and have their person use the same language. And then most of the time they win the district, don't they? And what's the first thing Republicans say once they've won the district? Now we have to move to the middle. Every time they do that, that's your party moving you to the left. Okay? It's a 100% equation. And you have to tell the base what's wrong with you. Okay? So, let me see. And what if the center line, the mean, has been aligned to a narrative while our perceptions do not account for it? What if we think we're sailing straight and in fact the narrative is heading left? And by the way, if rule one is there is no middle, once you've established Marxism, there is no exception to rule one. None. Okay? So now we're looking at this again. What if the center line, the mean, has been aligned to the narrative while our perceptions haven't accounted for that either? Well, that would mean we're moving to the left. And you see all those Republicans on the Outlier are defending their position, being in fights with everybody to the left of them on the outrigger, on the Trimaran, but they're on a Trimaran called the SS Marx, and their concept of being conservative is always relative to the boat, but they're sailing hard to the left. Okay, so being conservative now becomes a relative term. Fair enough? So, now, let's put on our Star Trek hats and call that a tractor beam. And now they're being reeled in. They're being reeled in like fish floundering. And that's where we come to Luntz's words that work. Remember I said political correctness is the enforcement mechanism to the postmodern narrative that executes Marxism? Remember I said that? Well, the prevailing cultural narrative is Marxism. So if you're using the words that work as a Republican, you're using words that work in the prevailing cultural narrative, which is cultural Marxism. And a lot of people don't know this, but after every congressional election, they have a retreat, and they bring in Luntz to talk about the words that will work. And the leadership imposes it on them. How many people knew that? But the minute Republicans use the words that work, that succumb or subordinate to the prevailing cultural narrative, they are effectively enforcing a politically correct narrative which supports neo-Marxist outcomes. Is that fair enough? So we get close to the break there, and you see that 8%. What are they going to try to do that 8%? Shear them off. Because, of course, there are rocks there. There's stuff there. Shear them off. That's you. That's you right now. That's getting rid of that MAGA people. That's being silent when that domestic terrorism document comes out from Biden. And by the way, this CVE narrative started with Judge Chertoff when he was the head of the DHS under President George Bush. This is bipartisan. So here you have it. So since the election, by the way, this is the 2014 election, I just want people to think, has anything changed? Since the election, hasn't the leadership been trying to shear off the ultra-conservatives while conservative members have been battling that same leadership over the hearts and minds of the party? Hasn't that been what's going on? Aren't these not words in support of a hostile narrative? So what you have here is, how many people have heard someone say, and I've heard generals say it when I was in the military, I've heard politicians in their office say this, political correctness gets in the way of our doing our job. How many people have heard that? Because if political correctness gets in the way of their doing their job, disobeying Marxist narratives is something they're afraid to do, and they will do it. So what's really important here is that once captured by the narrative, this means that the party establishment will be more afraid of being called a racist, sexist, or homophobe than of standing up for what he or she took an oath to support and defend. They are no longer supporting and defending the Constitution, and they're no longer on your side. They are backing the other side. So what does this do? This makes them a controlled opposition. Now, if you go to every contested state in this last election, it was Republican legislatures that rapidly ratified the elections. They couldn't ratify it fast enough. Why? Well, in our book, Re-Remembering the Misremembered Left in 2019, we said they were not only a controlled opposition, but they were going to be the defeat mechanism, the mechanism by which the left would secure their objectives. They would be the defeat mechanism of the left. By the way, that's a doctrinal term in strategic warfighting, okay? And we have it, it's quoted in our book what the actual definition is from one of the joint publications, Joint Chiefs of Staff publications. And what are we saying there? Remember, a movement can always be a movement. The left is a movement. But for them to be able to secure things, they have to institutionalize their movement. And who institutionalizes their movement? The Republicans. Did they not just do that in the last election? Okay. So what I'm pointing out is they are the defeat mechanism of the left. So for the left to disenfranchise you must first be demoralized. So when you have, when political correctness gets in the way of someone doing their job, they subordinate their oath to support and to defend the Constitution to the politically correct narrative, which is Marxism. It's really that simple. And with that, there's a whole lot of slides after this, but I'm going to stop here for this part of the briefing and go to the other part of the briefing if everybody's okay. But did people find that interesting? Is the visual picture helpful? Because I will tell you, this is a hot item in DC because this brief was given and everybody saw it play out. And I hate to say this exactly. And again, this is not anybody, especially me, being some kind of crystal ball magician. It is once you know how the left rolls, you can see it happening ahead of time. And I'll argue really strongly that we are completely oriented on trailing indicators. How do you know the dog died? Well, the indicator the dog died is that it was run over. Well, you know what? Leading indicators are there's a dog on the street, get it off the street so it doesn't get run over. And what I'm trying to say is we can create leading indicators to do that. So with that, what I'll do is I'll go to the other one. I must tell you, we're cutting into the middle of a brief on this one. Excuse me. And as I open it up, it starts at slide 35. But what you might want to see, and I'll go back to slide 35 if we could open it up. This is a test. This presentation is not done yet. It's called the Dialogue Praxis Project, and it's been updated a couple times, but it's explaining how the left works, and there are 318 slides. There'll probably be 50 or 60 more, and it will take a couple days. It'll be a day-long briefing, and it will hurt your mind so much that you'll have to see it a second time, because it's difficult. It's difficult to understand how the left really rolls, because the fact of the matter is it's weird, and you have to get over the weirdness. It's actually not hard, but we have slides that will say, for example, and I'm not going to highlight this yet, this is Lenin saying, right here in his book, that we follow Hegel and Hegel's weird mysticism, and it is mysticism. But what I want to do is start here, because we're just going to start at slide 35. So I'm passing up a whole lot of development slides just to create the visual picture, fair enough? To go into the the horizontal plane thinking we have, as opposed to the 3D motion of how the left really works. So here is me. So here is a picture of how the left operates, and you already see that it's been made opaque. The perfect future world is actually the science of reason. And I'll explain that what the left does is they have created a concept of science that makes their worldview scientifically true, so if you disagree with them, you're an idiot. Now, I will be one of those who say, my father died of COVID, so I'm not one of these people who takes it lightly. But I also put in writing, and we sent it to the National Security Council in March 2020, that the narratives on COVID were completely severable from COVID itself and had almost no relationship to the actual protection of the public. Witness that the left, the blue states allowed thousands of elderly people unprotected, actually made them vulnerable and killed them. And I will leave my father out of it in terms of how I think about that. But the inside word by people inside New York is upward of 35,000 elderly people died. And actually, I think that's why Cuomo's gone. I think that they know that they can't survive that. So what you have here is this is the triad from the left that comes from Hegel. At the top, you have this idea called the dialectic, and you see a wizard that's kind of blacked out there. Okay? And a famous article was written by a man whose name eludes me right now. But when it comes to me, probably tonight, after a couple of glasses of scotch, I'll remember. Vogelin. Vogelin wrote an article in the 1970s talking about Hegel and the wizard, to explain that his concepts were actually a form of alchemy, and what he meant was it really is a form of alchemy. And so the dialectic has those origins in terms of this model. The second part of the corner is the state. Now, Hegel said that the state is God bestriding the land. Now, it's really important because it was already a slide before this, but a lot of things happened under Woodrow Wilson that transitioned America from rights endowed by the Creator to privileges granted by the state. Okay? Because once you decide that the state is God, then the state has the right to grant and retract privileges. And I will argue that group rights is the antithesis of individual rights and exists by the state to negate them. And finally, we have this idea of science, identifying your worldview as scientifically correct so everybody's an idiot. The narratives on COVID, I will argue, are that. Okay? You have seen them purposely say things which were clearly erroneous, then enforce a rule, and then admit that the whole rule was wrong, the whole basis was wrong. They were doing it almost once every 3 weeks for a while there. So why is the point of there? It's scientifically true because the state said it's true. Put your damn mask on, or we'll make sure people club you to death in the street. That gets into the narrative arc, how that works, but that's how it works. So that's the triangle there. And of course, you're in the middle of that triangle, and you don't know. So, and while each of those three things are reinforcing each other, each one of them independently is attacking you. But the average citizen does not know they are being targeted for attack. They cannot know because these attacks reinforce each other. They don't understand that they're combined. So, perceiving you're under assault by various forces in the universe, you fail to recognize that they are targeted attacks that are also coordinated and interlocking. Fair enough? So, it's a complete disorientation. So, if we swap out Hegel for Marx, the dialectic becomes dialectical materialism. The science of reason, that's what Hegel called it, the science of reason, which was superior to the science of understanding. The science of reason was my metaphysical view. I have envisioned a perfect end state in the world, and it's scientifically valid. So today, I have a right to impose my scientific view on you. Well, what Marx called that was scientific socialism. And of course, you had the workers' paradise at the end of history. And then, of course, you have the all-powerful state. It's a one-to-one translation. Why do we know that? Because Marx said so. How else do we know it? Lenin said that Marx said so. How else do we know that? Mao said that Lenin said that Marx said so. So we know that this is correct. And it's weird, And nobody in political science wants to talk about this because they actually then have to do something like read Hegel. Okay. I heard those laughs, by the way. I'm in another room and I heard them. So actually, you actually don't have to read Hegel, but I'll tell you what the trick is. You should read some of them, though. So, but this is not how the target perceives the attack against him. You see, the triangle arrows are all of a sudden made opaque because you're not aware that they're reinforcing each other. You're not aware at all. And those endpoints are also made opaque. When executed as part of a mass line effort, obvious targets do not present themselves. You don't see why you're being attacked. You don't understand by whom. Now, time out. In the Maoist insurgency model, you have something called mass lines. A mass line is a group of people, okay? And if you have a narrative that gets them to do what you want, that's a mass line narrative that will get people to do what they want. So let me give you an example. Cuomo, realizing at the time they didn't have the legal basis to have people wear masks, came out with a advertising campaign saying it's about respect. And it's about the fact that, not wearing a mask means, that guy not wearing a mask over there might get your mother killed. So all of a sudden, lacking the authority on the street in law to actually pass something, Cuomo created a mass line narrative that got the mass line to go up and physically threaten you and assault you if necessary. That's the mass line. You could have a mass line that targets nurses for them to respond a certain way. So when we talk about when executed as part of a mass line effort, these are narratives that are intersyncing on various lines of effort that integrate on multiple levels. So when executed as part of a mass line effort, obvious targets do not present themselves. The target, that's you, the average person. The target is in the political warfare fog. It is strategically disoriented. They may not, the husband, the wife, the family, they may not recognize the threat. They may not even recognize there is a threat. They just don't understand why they're being attacked. So they cannot articulate a targetable response. So that's not what I briefed yesterday leading up to something that briefed the rest of this. But does this make sense, just for the purpose of going forward? That's how Marxism really works. And if your attack on Marxism doesn't account for this, doesn't account for their claims of science, you're out of the game. If it doesn't account for the fact that they are God, the state is God, you don't know what Woodrow Wilson did in 1916 because he did it. Okay? And there are slides before this that actually show that there's no question about it. The more I research this, the more I find out there were people in 1913 to 1960 who were pretty bad people that we don't hear about, but they're becoming well known. So it's at this point that I showed this yesterday to give people a sense for what they're looking at when they see that picture. Okay? And we're going to focus on Hegel because it's just more interesting. Okay? The Hegelian metaphysic, and this is a $10 quote, and I want to take it apart. The Hegelian metaphysic, a metaphysic is a worldview. You could say in certain instances it's a religious view. And by the way, it's the fact that Marxism is based on a metaphysic that is what gives Marxists on the street a religious fervor. And they know it. The term that Hegel used was Aufheben. And the term that the Frankfurt School created was Aufheben der Kultur, destroy the culture. You could translate Aufheben der Kultur into, anybody want to guess? Cancel culture. So there's absolutely nothing theoretical about this. Nothing. Okay? They know that Aufheben der Kultur is a metaphysical worldview. Teleologically informed means they have a target. They execute along an arc through time on a trajectory. They always know what they're attacking. And half the time you think you beat them, all they did was position you for the next round of negation. And if you don't know that that's how Marxism works, the simple fact of the matter is you're always losing. So you see these kindly men, old farmer men, the guy with the corn cob thing, they're playing checkers. And I use this as kind of a comical demonstration of what's going on. And I'd like to point out the man on the left is the man on the left. So, Did I skip extra slides? And I don't know why my computer does that. So we like to think, this is, okay, how dialectical attacks work in real time, in the real world. And I just go right off these slides, so I apologize for that. But we like to think of our foes as equal opposites following the same strategies to win as we do, but they're just on the other side. You are fantastically wrong when you think that. You are already defeated when you think that. On the other side of the table, as if on a flat two-dimensional surface, you're playing checkers. Your strategy of checkers against his strategy of checkers. And you know, that old man on the left will stay at the table playing checkers with you as long as you're willing to stay there and play. His job is to hold you at the table. So, in a sense, it's the same way we visualize the solar system. We visualize the solar system as something on a flat plane. Fair enough? But that's not how the solar system operates. The solar system operates this way. The solar system is actually operates along a helical trajectory through time. It's always moving. And you see, that creates a fundamentally different picture of how you combat something, the one to the other. Thinking we are contending against a mirror image foe fighting along a flat horizontal plane, the foe actually attacks helically along a vertical axis on a trajectory through time. Not left versus right, but opposing poles. The next slide, when I'm able to get somebody who has the capability to do it, because I don't, it will show that instead of 9 planets in the universe, we'll show 2, and they will always collide with each other. But one of them always survives and another always comes up to show negation. So apologies for the crude graphics here, but this is at the limit of my capability. But you see that this as they're playing checkers, this 3D, and please do not use the word 3D chess. Okay. When I hear that, I just cringe. But we see that right through the table, this dialectical attack is going to come. And I use that model as the concept of a dialectical attack. While we think the other side is moving horizontally along a flat plane, his movement actually reflects a vertical helix which comes right through the table, leading us to conclude that it's the other side's moves that make no sense, when in fact it's we who are confused, actually strategically disoriented, and completely reality dislocated. You see, I have a little homage here to Monty Python. That guy on the left never moved. He never moves. He never moves or is moved. His only job is to hold you at that table. And what's the guy on the right say? Wait, come back here. It's only a flesh wound. How many people remember the knight in Monty Python, getting dismembered? That's us. And part of the larger brief is my attack on people who use the word, well, we're going to jujitsu them at their own game. If you're playing their game, you're losing. This is a rule. If you're responding to them in their game, you're in the dialectic. You want to use popular language, you're in the blue pill. You're in the blue pill world. And if you're responding to them in the blue pill world, all you're doing is repositioning yourself for the next attack, dialectical attack. So with that, I think we can, I think that's about it. So with that, what I'd like to do is open up for questions. And my daughter told me that's really hokey, so I'm going to get rid of the slides and open like that. But with that, we're done with the presentations. And we did 3 things, and I know that I could pull up some stuff I put out on Twitter if I'm fast enough, but maybe not, about stuff I was saying today having to do with Afghanistan, and the fact that one of the things I had to say was there was no pretty way to get out of Afghanistan. And as my son is a member of the Army, I would hate to see him die in that war. So,
Steve, cannot thank you enough. Thank you so much.